Welcome to Buried Truths, where the dust of time is swept away and history's deepest secrets rise to the surface. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States initially chose a path of neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson urged Americans to remain impartial in thought as well as in action. The U.S. population was deeply divided, with immigrants from both Allied and Central Powers countries. While many Americans sympathized with Britain and France due to shared cultural and democratic ties, German and Irish Americans often favored neutrality or even the Central Powers. Wilson hoped to avoid entangling alliances and preserve American peace. Despite official neutrality, American economic interests increasingly leaned toward the Allies. British naval blockades prevented U.S. trade with Germany, while commerce with Britain and France flourished. American banks extended substantial loans to the Allied powers, tying U.S. prosperity to an Allied victory. Critics argued that economic favoritism made neutrality questionable. Wilson's administration defended these ties as legal under international law, but tensions rose. Germany accused the U.S. of favoring the Allies, sowing seeds of distrust between Washington and Berlin. Meanwhile, reports of German atrocities in Belgium and submarine warfare stirred American public opinion. British propaganda effectively painted Germany as a brutal aggressor. American newspapers circulated exaggerated stories of violence against civilians, igniting moral outrage. These narratives, though sometimes embellished, shaped the American view of the conflict. Religious leaders and social reformers began pushing Wilson to condemn German actions more strongly. The U.S. public became increasingly uneasy with the idea of staying neutral in a war with perceived moral dimensions. President Wilson, however, remained committed to peace. In 1915, he initiated diplomatic efforts to mediate between the warring sides. His peace without victory proposal emphasized negotiation rather than domination. Wilson believed the U.S. could serve as an impartial peacemaker and reshape global diplomacy. However, both the Allies and Central Powers dismissed his overtures. Still, Wilson's vision of moral diplomacy laid the groundwork for his later post-war agenda. He continued to appeal to the American people to stay out of the conflict. The 1916 presidential election became a referendum on war and peace. Wilson's campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," resonated with a war-weary public. His Republican opponent, Charles Evans Hughes, criticized Wilson's foreign policy as weak. Still, Wilson narrowly won re-election, largely due to strong support in the Midwest and among peace advocates. The victory reinforced Wilson's belief that Americans wanted neutrality. However, growing German aggression soon threatened to undo the president's efforts to keep the nation at peace. In the background, American military preparedness quietly advanced. Though Wilson opposed entering the war, he supported strengthening the military in case involvement became inevitable. Congress passed the National Defense Act of 1916, expanding the Army and creating military training programs. The Naval Act of 1916 promised a Navy second to none, anticipating future conflicts. These measures signaled a subtle shift in U.S. posture. While still officially neutral, America was gradually preparing for the possibility of war, recognizing that neutrality might not last. By the end of 1916, the illusion of strict neutrality had nearly vanished. Trade, propaganda, and security concerns had pulled the U.S. closer to the Allied cause. Though Wilson continued preaching peace, Germany's continued submarine warfare and diplomatic isolation of the U.S. were escalating. The nation stood at a crossroads, torn between isolationist ideals and global realities. Americans began realizing that staying out of Europe's war might not be possible forever. The stage was set for a shift from neutrality to engagement. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania in May 1915 marked a pivotal moment in America's path to war. A German U-boat torpedoed the British passenger liner, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. The public outrage was swift and intense. Although Germany claimed the ship carried munitions, many in the U.S. viewed the attack as barbaric. Wilson issued a stern protest, demanding accountability. Though war was avoided, tensions rose sharply as Americans questioned how long neutrality could be maintained amid such provocations. In response, Germany issued the Sussex Pledge in 1916, promising to limit submarine warfare and spare civilian lives. The pledge came after another attack on a French passenger ferry, the Sussex, which injured several Americans. Wilson warned that unrestricted attacks would not be tolerated. Germany, eager to avoid U.S. entry into the war, temporarily scaled back its U-boat campaign. However, doubts lingered in Washington. The promise seemed fragile, and Wilson knew that renewed submarine warfare could drag the U.S. into global conflict. Behind the scenes, American patience was wearing thin. Business leaders feared the loss of allied markets if Britain fell. Meanwhile, Wilson's cabinet began quietly preparing contingency plans. The public remained split, but pro-war voices grew louder. Former President Theodore Roosevelt criticized Wilson for being too passive. Many newspapers and civic groups called for stronger action. Though still committed to peace, Wilson began tightening diplomatic pressure on Germany. He also increased military readiness, ensuring the U.S. wouldn't be caught unprepared. The breaking point came in January 1917, when Germany announced a return to unrestricted submarine warfare. The move was a gamble, aimed at strangling British supply lines before American intervention. Wilson was dismayed and saw it as a betrayal. Diplomatic ties with Germany were severed. American ships were now at risk, and public support for neutrality began to crumble. The country braced for escalation. Even isolationists began questioning whether peace was still an option in light of Germany's defiance. Then came the Zimmermann telegram. In February 1917, British intelligence intercepted a message from Germany to Mexico, proposing a military alliance if the U.S. entered the war. Germany promised to help Mexico reclaim lost territories in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. When the message was published, Americans were outraged. The idea of a German-backed invasion stunned the public. Wilson now had tangible proof of a direct threat. The telegram united both pro-war and undecided citizens behind the need for action. By March 1917, German submarines had sunk several American merchant ships, killing U.S. sailors. These attacks erased any remaining doubts about Germany's intentions. In Congress, even previous opponents of war began calling for a response. Wilson addressed a joint session on April 2nd, declaring that the world must be made safe for democracy. The Senate voted overwhelmingly for war on April 4th, and the House followed on April 6th. The U.S. was now officially at war with Germany, ending years of neutrality. The U.S. entry into World War I marked a turning point not just for the war, but for American foreign policy. Isolation had given way to engagement. Wilson framed the conflict as a moral crusade, asserting U.S. values on the global stage. While many supported the cause, others feared the consequences of overseas entanglements. Still, the die was cast. America had stepped onto the world stage as a decisive power. The journey from neutrality to engagement had reached its dramatic conclusion. With war declared in April 1917, the United States faced the massive task of mobilizing its people and resources. The government moved swiftly, passing the Selective Service Act in May, requiring men aged 21 to 30 to register for the draft. By war's end, nearly 2.8 million men had been drafted. Posters, rallies, and celebrity endorsements encouraged enlistment and patriotism. The shift from neutrality to national war effort was rapid, as Americans prepared to fight a European conflict far from home. Training camps sprang up across the country, transforming raw recruits into soldiers. Camp Funston, Camp Meade, and others hosted tens of thousands of men. Instructors drilled troops on trench warfare, rifle use, and discipline. While training was often rushed, it was essential to prepare the inexperienced army. Women also volunteered. serving as nurses, telephone operators, and clerks. The military's expansion touched every community, and families sent loved ones off with pride and anxiety. The U.S. was building a fighting force from scratch. Beyond military mobilization, the government launched massive industrial efforts to supply the war machine. The War Industries Board, led by Bernard Baruch, coordinated factories to produce uniforms, weapons, and vehicles. Steel, coal, and railroad industries were prioritized. The Food Administration, led by Herbert Hoover, urged Americans to conserve food. Meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays became patriotic duties. The entire economy was restructured for war. Civilian life changed overnight as production shifted from consumer goods to military necessities at unprecedented scale. Financing the war was another major challenge. The U.S. government issued Liberty bonds, urging citizens to buy a share in victory. Public campaigns used posters and movie stars to promote bond purchases. Over $17 billion was raised. Taxes also increased, particularly on the wealthy. The Revenue Act of 1917 expanded federal income tax and introduced new excise taxes. War costs were staggering, but most Americans supported the effort. Patriotic duty, peer pressure, and fear of German aggression drove economic sacrifices on the home front. Propaganda became a key tool in uniting the population. The Committee on Public Information, CPI, led by George Creel, produced pamphlets, films, and posters to promote the war. The 4-Minute Men delivered short patriotic speeches in movie theaters. Anti-German sentiment soared. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. German-language newspapers declined, and schools dropped German classes. The CPI shaped public opinion, encouraging loyalty and stifling dissent. While effective, its tactics raised concerns about censorship and manipulation in a democratic society. Dissent did exist, especially among socialists, pacifists, and labor organizers. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 criminalized anti-war speech and actions. Thousands were arrested, including socialist leader Eugene V. Debs, sentenced to 10 years for an anti-war speech. Civil liberties were curtailed in the name of national security. Surveillance increased, and loyalty oaths became common. Though most Americans supported the war, others viewed these measures as dangerous overreaches of government power that threatened constitutional freedoms. Despite these tensions, the United States successfully transformed itself into a war-ready nation. Factories boomed, the military swelled, and the public adapted to rationing, volunteering, and sacrifice. The country emerged from its isolationist shell with a sense of purpose. Mobilization demonstrated America's industrial might and political unity. By late 1918, U.S. troops were arriving in Europe in massive numbers. The groundwork laid during 1917-1918 would prove decisive. The nation had gone from hesitant observer to powerful participant in just over a year. By mid-1917, the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, began arriving in France under the command of General John J. Pershing. Initially, U.S. troops were kept separate from Allied units to train and avoid disunity. Pershing insisted American forces fight under U.S. command. Early arrivals supported logistics and supply operations. Troops drilled intensively in trench warfare and gas attack defense. Morale was high. These soldiers believed they were fighting to make the world safe for democracy, as President Wilson had declared when entering the war. The first U.S. combat involvement came in late 1917 and early 1918. In November 1917, American troops entered trenches near Nancy, France. The Battle of Cantigny in May 1918 marked the first major offensive led by American forces. U.S. troops captured the village from German control, demonstrating their capabilities. Though the victory was limited in scale, it boosted Allied morale. These early battles hardened the AEF and gave commanders valuable insights. American soldiers were proving they could match experienced European armies. As German offensives pushed West in spring 1918, American involvement intensified. In June, U.S. forces helped stop the German advance at Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood. The Marines' stand at Belleau Wood became legendary. Facing intense artillery and machine gun fire, they refused to retreat. Casualties were severe, but their tenacity stunned German commanders. "Retreat? Hell, we just got here!" one Marine famously said. Belleau Wood became a symbol of American grit and established the Marines' fierce battlefield reputation. By late summer 1918, the AEF took on a larger role in Allied operations. In September, they launched the Saint-Mihiel Offensive, marking the first fully American-led assault. Over 500,000 U.S. troops participated, supported by tanks and aircraft. The operation succeeded in days, capturing German positions and proving American logistical and operational strength. Pershing's strategy emphasized aggressive action over static defense. This victory helped shape Allied plans for the final push. The U.S. had demonstrated its capacity for large-scale independent operations. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, beginning on September 26, 1918, was America's largest military operation of the war. Over 1.2 million American soldiers fought in difficult terrain against entrenched German defenders. The fighting lasted 47 days and was brutal. Supply problems, inexperienced officers, and muddy conditions slowed progress. Despite this, U.S. forces gradually pushed forward. It was a grinding campaign, but essential to break German lines. The offensive showcased America's growing strength and the human cost of modern war, with over 26,000 Americans killed. Among the heroes of the Meuse-Argonne was Alvin York, a Tennessee marksman. On October 8, 1918, York led an attack that resulted in the capture of 132 German soldiers. He became one of the most decorated Americans of the war. African-American units, such as the Harlem Hellfighters, also distinguished themselves fighting bravely despite segregation. They spent more time in combat than most white units. Their valor challenged racial stereotypes, though they returned home to continued discrimination and limited recognition. By November 1918, American forces were driving German troops back across a wide front. The influx of fresh U.S. troops had tipped the balance. Exhausted and facing mutinies at home, Germany agreed to an armistice. On November 11th, the guns fell silent. The American military had transformed the war's outcome in less than 2 years. Over 4 million Americans served, and 116,000 died. Though late to the fight, U.S. troops proved decisive. Their courage and sacrifice helped bring the war to an end. As American soldiers fought abroad, the U.S. home front underwent profound changes. The federal government expanded rapidly to coordinate the war effort. The War Industries Board managed production, setting priorities for factories. The Food Administration urged citizens to conserve with campaigns like Meatless Mondays. Rationing wasn't mandatory, but patriotism drove compliance. Posters encouraged citizens to grow victory gardens. Women and children joined volunteer efforts. Propaganda urged unity, and slogans like "Do your bit" became national mantras, fostering a collective wartime spirit. Economically, the war triggered massive industrial growth. Factories converted to war production, generating jobs and boosting the economy. Unemployment dropped sharply as workers were needed in shipyards, ammunition plants, and steel mills. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, taking jobs once reserved for men. African Americans migrated north in the Great Migration, seeking opportunities and escaping Jim Crow laws. These demographic shifts reshaped cities. However, workplace tensions, wage disputes, and strikes also emerged as labor demand and inflation rose. The government financed the war through Liberty bonds and taxes. Americans were encouraged to buy bonds as a patriotic duty. Celebrities promoted them in parades and public rallies. The Revenue Acts of 1916 and 1917 raised taxes, especially on wealthy individuals and corporations. The federal budget swelled, reaching unprecedented levels. War-related spending stimulated economic activity, but also increased national debt. Despite costs, public enthusiasm remained high. Most Americans saw bond purchases not as burdens, but as contributions to victory. Socially, the war sparked major changes. With men overseas, women stepped into public roles. They served as nurses, ambulance drivers, and factory workers. Their contributions challenged gender norms and strengthened calls for suffrage. The National American Woman Suffrage Association linked war service to voting rights. In 1918, President Wilson endorsed the 19th Amendment, citing women's war efforts. Though ratification came in 1920, the groundwork was laid during wartime. For many women, the war was a turning point in public life. African Americans faced a paradox. While thousands served abroad and worked in wartime industries, they encountered segregation and discrimination. In uniform, black soldiers were often confined to labor roles and rarely saw combat. On the home front, northern cities saw racial tensions rise with the influx of black workers. Race riots broke out in cities like East St. Louis in 1917. Still, organizations like the NAACP gained momentum, demanding civil rights. The war laid bare the contradictions in American democracy. The Espionage Act of 1917 and Sedition Act of 1918 cracked down on dissent. Speaking against the war or criticizing the government could lead to prison. Socialist leader Eugene V. Debs was jailed for anti-war speeches. The government used the Committee on Public Information to shape public opinion and suppress opposition. German Americans were targeted. Schools dropped German classes, and sauerkraut was renamed Liberty, Cabbage. Civil liberties eroded during wartime, as patriotism sometimes gave way to paranoia and suppression. Politically, the war shifted American governance. Federal authority expanded as Washington took greater control of the economy and society. This centralization set precedents for future crises. The war also reshaped foreign policy. Wilson envisioned a new world order based on democracy and collective security. His post-war plans, including the League of Nations, emerged from these home-front experiences. While not all reforms lasted, World War I marked a transformation in how the U.S. mobilized resources, managed dissent, and envisioned its global role. World War I ended in November 1918 with an armistice halting fighting. The United States, under President Wilson, played a crucial role in shaping the post-war world. The peace negotiations began in Paris in January 1919, with the Allies demanding harsh terms for Germany. Wilson, however, proposed his 14 points, advocating for self-determination, free trade, and the establishment of the League of Nations. Wilson hoped these ideals would prevent future wars, but European powers were less interested in his vision. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, officially ending the war. The treaty placed full blame for the war on Germany and imposed severe reparations, stripping it of territories and military power. Wilson's 14 points were largely sidelined, with the League of Nations being the only point included. Many European leaders, especially French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, pushed for harsh penalties to ensure Germany could never threaten Europe again. Wilson faced opposition to the treaty at home. The U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Despite Wilson's efforts, including a nationwide tour to garner support, many senators feared that joining the League would entangle the U.S. in future European conflicts. Isolationism, a key theme of American foreign policy, was stronger than Wilson's internationalism. The Senate's rejection marked a clear divide in U.S. foreign policy, with the country choosing to remain outside European entanglements despite its crucial role in the war. Despite the U.S. refusal to join the League, the treaty's provisions reshaped Europe and the world. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German, and Russian empires led to new nations and borders. The Weimar Republic was established in Germany, but the country's economic and political instability set the stage for future conflict. In the Middle East, The British and French took control of former Ottoman lands, creating mandates that sowed the seeds of future regional tensions. The war's human cost was staggering, with an estimated 16 million dead and millions more wounded. Many soldiers returned home traumatized, with shell shock and other psychological wounds. The war also left deep scars on the civilian population. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919, which killed millions, compounded the devastation. Economically, the war left countries deeply in debt. The U.S. emerged as the world's leading creditor, but Europe's economic instability would fuel tensions leading to the Great Depression. For the United States, the war marked a shift in global power. While it did not join the League of Nations, it became an economic and military superpower. The war had spurred industrial and technological innovation, particularly in aviation, medicine, and communication. It also led to a rise in American cultural influence, with Hollywood and American products becoming symbols of modernity. The U.S. was poised to shape the 20th century, but the road to global leadership would be fraught with challenges. The aftermath of World War I had far-reaching consequences. The punitive peace terms set the stage for World War II. Many historians argue that the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, particularly the reparations on Germany, created the conditions for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. The U.S., despite its reluctance to engage in European politics, would be drawn into another world conflict 2 decades later, reshaping the world once again. The Great War's legacy continued to shape history. If you're passionate about uncovering the forgotten stories of our past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Don't forget to like the video if you're enjoying the journey so far, and stay tuned, because there's so much more history waiting to be unearthed right here on Buried Truths.